G'day all, welcome, hope you're doing well. Welcome church family, welcome to those who've been following us in our new series or in our past series. So good to have you join us. A couple of things to remind you about. Don't forget to plug into Cell Group. You can go to online, check out the website and plug into or reach out to people there. Don't forget to subscribe to the Married People Monthly, some great content for relationships in that space. Don't forget, church family, to return your tithe and your offering. And we're kicking into a new theme, a new series for our Kids Cell kids. So real cool looking theme. So plug into that, parents. You can find details about that in the worship guide for each Sabbath. And don't forget, check out God Time content that's emailed to you every Sunday night to work through with your kids during the week to spend God time together. The XL High kicking off into the new series. You can find their new video that's been uploaded into the XL High playlist, so check that out. They're doing Forensic Faith, and so are the adults. We're doing Forensic Faith as well, and we're doing it in the cell group setting. It's really good content, really helpful, really useful, really insightful, very inspiring, and very challenging. So plug into cell because that's the space where we're doing Forensic Faith. All right. And we're going to get into our time of prayer. So let's read through the disciples' prayers taught by Jesus to them, and we'll have a moment of silence. All right, so let's get into it. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Excuse me, give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. And the church say amen. And I keep forgetting to click the silence light. All right, so as I said, we're kicked off last week into our new series, Finding Truth. And it's to complement the Forensic Faith content that we're working through in Cell. Please grab the book, get a hold of the book, plug into your Cell, and the participants guide should already be with your Cell leader or in your own hands. So work through that in your Cell group time. And in our Finding Truth series, each Saturday we've been exploring these questions and answering these questions that you can see on your screen right now. I'm not going to read through all of them. You can check out last week. I read through all of them last week. All right, or you can just pause the video and read the questions yourself. All right, so we're looking at, we started last week answering the question, is there a God? And there are only two possible answers to this question. Yes, and the yes is theism. The other answer is no, and that essentially is atheism. And last week I addressed the issue of I don't know, so go back and watch that video and you can see why I don't know isn't a possible answer to the question, is there a God? And our approach has been to provide key arguments for and against both theism and atheism. So last week we looked at the arguments for theism, and we outlined some of those, as you can see there on the screen: fine-tuning, DNA, scientific based stuff. You got scientific theories like Big Bang Theory, fine-tuning, molecular machines as a biological evidence, and then you got cosmological argument. And this week we're going to tackle the other three arguments: the argument against theism, and the argument for and against atheism. So we're going to look at those other three arguments today. All right. So, and then what we might do is at the end put these four arguments on the screen on a scorecard and see how they line up with each other. All right, so let's crack into it because we've got a lot to get through today, so I want to really smash it out in the next 35 to 40 minutes, if that's okay with you. So let's look at the arguments against theism. So the first one is a lack of empirical evidence. The argument here is there is a real lack of empirical evidence for the existence of a God. And basically we cannot see, hear, smell, touch, perhaps even taste a God through our senses. So therefore, essentially what this argument is our experience through our senses, our observational senses, is strong evidence against the existence of a God. And thus we cannot observe through our senses. And if we cannot observe, we cannot test. And if we cannot test, we cannot conclude. And really that actually makes a whole lot of sense. If I said to you, hey, last night I was hanging out and God came to see me and we talked for half an hour face to face. How would you respond to that statement that I made? Even if you're a believer in God, you would be skeptical. You'd be highly skeptical of the statement that I've just made. And I suggest that there are two main reasons, two notions as to why you'd be skeptical of my statement. Number one, you may have never seen, talked with God face to face yourself. And even if you have talked to God face to face, who's to say that the being you talked to was the same being that I talked to? So that's a pretty good argument or reason, rationale for your skepticism. Another reason for skepticism is I cannot present you any evidence that God and I talked face to face other than my personal testimony. Even if my personal testimony is true and truthful, it's still my personal testimony. It happened in a private space, so there is no evidence that I can present to you that God and I talked face to face. So it totally makes sense that there's a lack of empirical evidence, observational evidence that goes through my senses, through your senses, for a God. In fact, the only way I can probably convince you of the truthfulness of my claim is to provide evidence that is actually empirical. And we won't get into that, but the forensic faith content takes us through some of that and reflects on some of that. However, there is also plenty of things in our world that lack empirical evidence. For example, gravity. Have you ever seen, touched, heard, tasted gravity? Well, the answer is no. Yet we haven't seen it, we can't touch it, we can't feel it, and all those sorts of observational things. Yet we believe gravity exists because we've been told that what keeps you firmly planted on terra firma is gravity. But there's no empirical evidence for gravity. In fact, gravity is actually a theory. So that's one example of how there's something in the world that lacks empirical evidence. Another is H2O. Have you ever seen, touched, or tasted H2O? Well, no, you haven't. You've seen, touched, and tasted water, but H2O? I don't think so. The thing is, we've been told that H2O is water. So because we've been told that, we believe that H2O is water, even though we haven't ourselves observed H2O as water. So there's a couple of pushbacks on the idea, on the argument against theism, that there's a lack of empirical evidence, because you can argue both sides of that argument. All right, so that's the first piece of argument around against theism. Here's another one: a lack of design. There's plenty of atheists who argue this So essentially, some have argued that there are things in nature that indicate a lack of design. The problem is the lack of design argument really isn't an argument for a lack of design in nature, but of things being poorly designed. For example, in the picture there is an African locust. Well, I hope so. It looks like an African holding it. As an African, that African locust, according to materialistic scientists or even atheistic scientists, they will critique the poor design of the locust. And their critique of the poor design of the locust is they say they've studied the African locust, and the nerve cells start in the abdomen and connect to the wing, and they're like, that's really unnecessary use of materials. Another one is a flightless bird that has wings like an ostrich. The criticism there is, why would you design or create a bird that has wings but can't fly? Again, that's just, it's a silly design, and it's a waste of materials. And that's actually quite a weak argument, the idea of a lack of design. And anyway, if you think about logically around this argument of a lack of design, think about it this way. If a lack of design is an argument against the existence of a God, then the presence of design is an argument for the existence of God. And there are plenty of things in the world that are clearly designed. So the lack of design argument becomes really challenging when you think about the other side of the coin to that argument. The presence of design leads to the presence of a God, because the lack of design leads to a non-existent God. So we're stuck in that space. And by the way, where there's the presence of one thing, it negates the non-existence of everything else. And Dr. Pandit gives a really good illustration of that. He talks about how if you're sitting in an auditorium and someone said, and they were trying to figure out whether there was a mouse in the room, and every chair had a dot on it, and white dots represented the non-existence of a mouse, and red dots represented that there was a mouse in the house. And essentially what Dr. Pandit says, and his theory and the idea is, I've already said it, the red dot is for the mouse. So let's say everyone's sitting now in the room, and everyone looks at their chair, and they look at, there are 100 chairs in the room, and 99 of those chairs have a white dot, and a white dot means there is no mouse in the house. But that last chair has a red dot on it, and underneath that chair is sitting a mouse, because that's where mice like to sit. In our example, they like to sit under a chair. So under that chair, there's a mouse represented by this red dot. So here's the thing: if there was one red dot in 99 white dots, that existence of that one dot completely negates the existence of that one red dot completely negates all the white dots. So just that one dot means that everything else fails. The argument completely fails. And that's how I deal with this lack of design argument. It's really challenging to say, well, there are things that show a lack of design or really poor design. Well, there's plenty of things that show actual design. Well, those things that show actual design completely negate the other argument. Anyway, you can explore that more for yourself and do some research around that. I'll spend enough time on it. We've got to keep moving. All right, so hopefully that's been useful too. Here's a real big one that's pushed by those who call themselves agnostics and those who are atheists. And they'll talk about how the existence of pain and suffering, of evil, is evidence against the existence of a God. Now, the problem is that both theists and atheists will struggle with this issue. This isn't unique to theism. And the thing is, and the argument, the essence of this argument is pain and suffering means there is no God. If there is pain and suffering, because there is pain and suffering, there is no God. Because a good, benevolent God, especially as espoused by Christianity, a good and benevolent God would not allow for pain and suffering to exist. So pain and suffering exists, therefore God doesn't exists. Again, we run into that same problem in terms of logic. If pain and suffering equals no God, then the opposite to pain and suffering, joy and pleasure, leads to evidence for God. Because that's logic. That's a real logical argument. So we have a problem again with this argument that pain and suffering means there is no God, because all of us experience pain and suffering, okay, no God, but all of us also experience the opposite of pain and suffering, which is joy and pleasure. So if we experience joy and pleasure, and pain and suffering means no God, then joy and pleasure, the opposite of pain and suffering, must mean there is a God. Okay, well, what is there anything else that we can point to? Well, what about the necessity of pain? We need pain. Pain indicates when something is wrong or something wrong has been done. Let's say, for example, let's say you and I are in the kitchen and we're collaborating on a meal, and you happen to lean on the stovetop element, which is on max heat. What is it within you that tells you you need to take your hand off the stovetop now? Well, it's going to be your pain receptors. Your pain receptors are going to tell you you need to take your hand off the element right now. Your hand is burning. And if you didn't feel the pain, you wouldn't know to remove your hand from the stovetop. And the thing is, because I feel pain too, I would immediately, having seen you in pain, I would immediately blast the cold water tap and get out of your way so that you can deal with your hand. So not only does pain indicate when something is wrong or something wrong has been done, it also indicates, or it helps to create, understanding and empathy. The bottom line is we need pain. In fact, those who live in a world where they can't experience pain struggle with life. They find themselves in a whole lot of danger, and they can put themselves in harm's way because they need their pain receptors to tell them danger is approaching, we are about to engage in something dangerous or harmful. So we need pain. Okay, well, I get that. I can accept that we need pain. I can understand how the opposite of pain and suffering, joy and pleasure, is evidence for God. All right, I get the logic behind that. But what about evil? Evil is clearly evidence that a God doesn't exist, because again, a good benevolent God would not let evil exist. All right, so let's think through the logic of that statement. So if there is evil in the world, then there must be good, because you cannot know that something is bad or evil unless you have something to measure it by, which is good, something to compare it with, which is good, because good is the opposite of evil. And the thing is, if there is good, then there must be a moral law that defines or establishes what is good, and therefore is able to help us identify what is evil. So you need that moral law to say, well, this is what good is, and therefore, because this is what good is, this is what evil is. So if you have a moral law, you're going to need a moral law giver or a moral law creator. So let's reverse engineer that and think about it this way. If there is no moral law giver, then there is no moral. And remember, the moral law giver for the theist is a God. If there's no moral law giver, then there can't be a moral law. If there is no moral law that helps us to define what good is, then there is no good. But good is the opposite of evil. But if good doesn't exist, then neither does evil. Evil doesn't exist either. The thing is, there are very few people on this planet besides psychopaths who would say that evil does not exist. And clearly evil does. So again, the argument for evil breaks down. Evil, pain, and suffering essentially then becomes evidence for theism rather than evidence against theism. which is a really interesting conclusion to reach. All right, so we've got, let's see, what were we had a lack of empirical evidence against, that was an argument against theism. We had a lack of design. It's another argument against theism, but we've already challenged those arguments quite strongly. Evil, pain, and suffering is another argument, but we've just shown that that can be flipped to the side of arguing for theism. And then finally, probably the strongest argument against theism. And note that this is not an argument for atheism. It's an argument against theism. And I'll explain why it's not an argument for atheism later on. So evolution helps explain the origin of life. Big Bang explains the origins of the universe. Evolution theory explains or offers an explanation for the origins of life on planet Earth and probably across the universe. Again, evolution is a theory. It's evolution evidence for the origins of life, proves that God doesn't exist. That's the statement or the idea or the notion that atheists and even materialists will come up with. So essentially, what is the theory of evolution? The theory of evolution is that life evolved from a single organism, and that organism evolved into varying types and kinds of creatures by a process of random mutations and natural selection, which is where you get that phrase, the survival of the fittest. And as part of that random process of mutation and natural selection, given enough time, those random mutations will lead to new species or new kinds of species, for example, from an ape to a human. Okay, so what is the problem with this theory? The problem with this theory is that science is based on observation and measurement. Again, we're going back to that lack of empirical evidence thing. And no one has been able to observe and then measure the evolution of species into one species into another species. So evolution actually has the problem of having a significant lack of empirical evidence. No one has observed the evolution of man from ape, nor from man to something else. And don't get me started on transhumanism, because that's the next level that technology is trying to push us towards. I'm not going to say any more on that. Save it for another time. And scientists have looked into history to try and find evidence, but no evidence exists. The evidence essentially was invented, and I'll get to that in a moment. And the other problem is that no one will live long enough, and no one has lived long enough to measure and observe this evolution from one species to another species. And I know I'm talking about macroevolution, and they'll try and distinguish between macroevolution and microevolution. Microevolution is simply adaptation. You try to stick the word evolution there just to make it sound closer to evolution than towards adaptation, but essentially what it is, you adapt to your environment. And microevolution is extremely small and extremely micro. That's why it's called micro. All right, so like I said hinted a little bit earlier, not only is there a lack of empirical evidence for evolution, a lot of the evolution touted as undeniable evidence for evolution that's still in our school textbooks and in our university textbooks has been shown to be fraudulent. I mean, for example, here's one. There's quite a few, but here's one. One is the evolution of whales. Apparently, whales started off as some type of hyena walking on land, and over millions and billions of years, that mutated through evolutionary process, and you ended up with the whale. And there's even a website, Live Science, that put up an article, posted an article in 2018, 2 years ago, and they said quite clearly, you can see at the top of the screen here, the story of the origin of whales is one of evolution's most fascinating tales and one of the best examples scientists have of natural selection. In other words, the theory of evolution. What's interesting for me is the last two words on that first line, fascinating tale, because that's what it ended up being. Someone did a whole lot of work around this evolution. In fact, they put together 25 pages in an appendix of their book that went through all the fraudulent evidence that was put forward, where they manipulated the fossil evidence to try and prove the evolution of whales. So there you go, whale evolution fraud. And that article was posted 4 years before this article here. So clearly there are scientists, or there are scientific organizations or groups who are still trying to put out stuff that's actually fraudulent and being proven to be fraud. So that's quite interesting. Here's a real famous one. This is work done by Ernst Haeckel, just out of Darwin, having put together his Origin of the Species book. And so he came along and he said he'd done all this research under a microscope type deal, and he studied all these different embryos as they grew and developed into fully formed species. And his pictures show quite clearly that we all came from the same thing, because they all look like the development of a fetus into a baby, like a human baby. So it's not a big leap to shift from this idea of amoeba or organism into fully formed human. The problem is that this is New Scientist, and they posted this article in 2015, and mind you, years earlier, scientists discovered that Haeckel's illustrations were all fraudulent. He had actually drawn the illustrations himself to try and make his point. So you know how I talked last week about bias, confirmation bias? We've all got that. Everyone on the planet has confirmation bias. Haeckel had confirmation bias. His confirmation bias was, I've got to make my evidence work. So I'm going to manipulate the evidence, draw these pictures just to try and make this thing work. By the way, this picture still exists in scientific textbooks that our kids are being taught, and even at university level. No one is coming out and saying, oh, by the way, that stuff's fraudulent, it's not real, it doesn't exist. This is actually a great example of how good scientists can be at drawing pictures and being really artistic, a little bit like the coronavirus artistry. But anyway, I'm going to move on from that. So there you go. There's some real evidences that point against evolution by evolutionists. All right, so there's some helpful examples for you around that. Let's look at arguments against atheism. I'm starting to feel like what I just gave against theism was actually against atheism as well. But anyway, so let's look at arguments against atheism. What is there specifically from an atheistic standpoint that can be an argument against atheism? Well, firstly, atheism disallows evidence. We just pointed to that in the last segment. Essentially, you cannot prove that something that doesn't exist. And Dr. Pandey puts it quite brilliantly. He talks about the example of a plane. Let's imagine that planes don't exist. There's no such thing as a plane. Now let's imagine we're going for a walk through a paddock and we come across a wing of a plane, and we come across the seats of a plane. We cannot claim that that wing and that seat come from or belong to a plane, because a plane cannot exist. They may be from a boat, they may be from a submarine, they may be from some other structure, but it cannot be a plane because planes don't exist. That wing and that seat must be for something other than a plane, because planes don't exist. You cannot prove that something that doesn't exist. So the implication is that any evidence that an atheist brings cannot prove God's non-existence, because you cannot prove the non-existence of something that doesn't exist. So that evidence that you're trying to provide for something that doesn't exist has to be for evidence something other than God. I hope that makes sense to you. All right, so that's one. Atheism disallows evidence. Secondly, science doesn't actually disprove the existence of a God. And remember, atheism's fundamental premise we talked about last week was science and reason, which is a really bold claim, to say, no, I rely on science and I rely on reason, and science and reason clearly shows me that God doesn't exist. Well, science doesn't disprove the existence of God. In fact, let's look at the US National Academy of Sciences as quoted by Victor J. Stinger in one of his articles. The US National Academy of Sciences says this: science can say nothing about the supernatural. Whether God exists or not is a question about which science is neutral. It is limited, that science is limited to explaining the natural world through natural causes. So in other words, science excludes the study of the supernatural. In fact, that really is the philosophy of science. That's not actual science. Science cannot prove the non-existence of God. In fact, nothing in the natural world can disprove the existence of God. And the problem is that atheists love to say science has proven that the non-existence of a God. Well, no, it hasn't. In fact, we've just clearly seen that science can't prove anything about the supernatural, and that's the realm in which God exists. And even atheists talk, well, that's supernatural, it's not natural. We live in a natural world, there is no God. Well, the problem is you can't make that statement using science, because science isn't about proving the non-existence of God. Science cannot do that. It has to remain neutral in that space. In fact, as we showed last week, science points toward the existence of a God rather than away from it. So there we go. All right, so arguments against atheism. Atheism disallows evidence. Science cannot prove the non-existence of God. And lastly, everything came from nothing is a really poor argument. If there is no God, the only other option is nothing. In other words, the universe came from nothing. And that's a statement that atheism will hold on to. If there's no God, the only other option really is nothing. In other words, the universe came from nothing. And the atheists will argue back, yeah, but the universe began from singularity. Well then, so where did singularity come from? Well, the answer to that would be, well, it didn't come from somewhere, it always existed. The problem is, if singularity always existed, then the universe always existed, because everything in the universe existed inside singularity. But if the universe always existed, then that totally contradicts what almost all scientists accept today, that the universe had a beginning at the Big Bang. And we saw Stephen Hawking, brilliant physicist, last week we saw his quote around the idea that everything began, the universe began at the Big Bang. So we have a problem. Either the universe always existed or it began. Well, let's see what some of the most brilliant minds of materialistic science have to say. What some of these brilliant atheistic scientific minds? Well, here's Victor Stinger. Victor Stinger says this: the only reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, the void out of which the universe spontaneously arose. Notice the key words there: reasonable belief. Here's Quinton Smith. The only reasonable belief is that we came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. So we've got a problem here. Two bigwig scientists are both saying, well, we came from nothing. Something came from nothing. And then they say, well, that's a reasonable belief. It's a reasonable thing to believe. So there you go. That's not science. That's a religious statement. That's a belief statement. And by the way, there are actually two big problems with singularity, which atheists charge those who believe creation with. And those two big problems with singularity is the lack of observational data and the lack of scientific explanation, which is the same accusations that atheists will make towards creation. Excuse me. So the lack of observational data, the accusation is there, no one has seen creation. Well, that's true. No one has seen creation, and no one has seen singularity as well. Lack of scientific explanation. There's no scientific explanation for creation. Yes, that's true, perhaps. And there's no scientific explanation for singularity either. So we've got the same problem with singularity as we do with creation, if you want to apply scientific laws to that observation or that argument. But so let's ask the logical question: can something like the universe or anything else come from nothing? Well, the answer is no. This is simply common sense. Something always comes from something, never from nothing. And that's exactly what the atheists, or what atheism would have us believe, that something came from nothing, because we just saw Victor Stenger and Quinton Smith both say something, the universe, came from nothing. Well, I used to love maths back in the day. Let's look at this from a mathematical point of view. Here's some math. 0 plus 0 plus 0 equals 100. That's atheistic maths. Atheistic math says 0 plus 0 plus 0 gave you 100. Theistic math says 0 plus something gives you 100. That's algebra. So let's put it this way. For atheism, nothing did nothing about nothing and produced everything. That's atheistic maths. Theistic math says this: someone did something about nothing and produced the universe. And that makes a whole lot more sense. You can get to 100 that way. You can't get to 100 through a whole lot of zeros. I mean, you could grab the zeros and put them together, but you need a 1 in front of it to get you to the 100. So there you go. There's some arguments against atheism. So let's look now at the arguments for atheism. What are the arguments for atheism? Well, let's have a look at them. There you go. There are no arguments for atheism. Because to say that there is no God requires complete and perfect knowledge of the entire universe. Think about it this way. Let's imagine you walk into a room full of 100 people. And you walk into that room and you get up the front, you jump onto the podium, you grab the microphone, and you make this declaration. There is no one in this room named Simon. Well, how can you know that no one in that room of 100 people is named Simon? Well, the only way you can know that there is no one in that room named Simon is if you went to every person in that room, talked to all 100 people, got their names, and figured out there's no one in this room named Simon. That's perfect and complete knowledge. So let's apply that to the idea of God. If God exists, then he must be somewhere in the universe, and thus he should be able to be found. We should be able to find him. So all you need to know, what you need to be able to do is to be able to go through every nook and cranny of the universe, and be able to get to those different nooks and crannies in the entire universe and find him through somewhere in that somewhere in that universe. Let me try and re-say that, because I'm not making sense of that. If God exists, then he must be somewhere in the universe. Thus, we should be able to find him. But in order to be able to find him in the universe, you need to have been to and know every nook and cranny of the entire universe. And scientists estimate there are 200 billion galaxies in the universe, because you need to be to every nook and cranny of the universe, and so that you can see if God is actually there. And the thing is, even if you have been to every nook and cranny and you can say there is no God, when you turn up to that one spot, the problem is when you turn up there and say, yep, no, there's no God here, you go to the next galaxy, yep, there's no God here, go to the next galaxy, yep, there's no God here, go to the next galaxy, yep, there's no God here. Even if you were to travel to every one of those galaxies, every point, every nook and cranny in the entire universe, every spot in the universe, and you stood there and you said, there is definitely no God because I can't find him here, I can't find him here, and I can't find him here. The problem is that he may have moved. So you would need to be at every spot, every nook and cranny of the entire universe at the exact same time to be ordered to say with all complete and perfect knowledge, there is no God. In fact, the problem is that the moment you are in every nook and cranny of the universe at the same time, making that declaration based on the evidence, the empirical evidence that there is no God here because I'm everywhere in the entire universe and clearly there is no God, that actually makes you God. Because if you are everywhere at once and you have complete knowledge, you are God. All right, so like I said at the beginning that we would put this all on a scorecard and have a look at that. So let's look at the scorecard. So for atheism, what are the arguments for atheism? Well, there are none, because you can't prove a negative statement. You can only prove a positive one. And by the way, atheists won't provide any arguments for atheism, actually. They'll actually provide lots of arguments against theism, because they got nothing from a for atheism point of view to argue from. What about arguments against atheism? Well, you got it disallows evidence. Science doesn't disprove the existence of God, and something can't come from nothing. For theism, you got a lack of empirical evidence. And by the way, I already challenged these against theism ones. Lack of empirical evidence, a lack of design, evolution is another one against theism. Evil, pain, and suffering is another one against theism. For theism, the arguments for theism, the Kalam cosmological argument, well, these are only some: DNA, fine-tuning the universe, Big Bang theory, irreducible complexity, and evil, pain, and suffering. So when you look at that table, it's starting to skew really strongly towards theism. It's very clearly in favor of theism. In fact, you could probably remove evil, pain, and suffering as an against theism argument and just have it solely sitting in the theistic argument. In any case, they cancel each other out. So I'm hoping that you're able to see in these past two episodes that there is a God. The evidence is strongly in favor of the existence of a God. The question next that we have to answer is, if there is a God, and I'm quite convinced and quite convicted that I've been able to provide you significant evidence for theism. If there is a God, can that God be known? That's the question we now have to answer. So what we're going to begin to do is that we're going to journey into that space in the next few weeks and answer that question and the questions that came after it. Hey family, I hope that this has been really useful to you. I hope you've gotten something out of this and helped to develop your own evidential case for it. And I want to encourage you, plug into Cell and work through developing your forensic faith in this space. Hey, blessings to you. I encourage you again, share this video with others. My apologies if I start to ramble on a little bit. There's so much content, just trying to what's the word I'm looking for? Package it in a way that can be delivered in a succinct and brief time frame. So go through, rewatch it again, share it with your friends, have a conversation around this stuff, because I think it's really significant, really powerful stuff. It's really useful stuff. Blessings to you. Have a great week, and we'll catch you next week, same time, same place, same person. All right, same human being, not person. All right, blessings to you. Ciao.